Good morning, everyone. Day 2. We're off to a good start, I hope. Everyone's charged up, energized, and I think this is a great session to kick off the day. This is our special guest presentation, and our special guest speaker's name is Chris Taggart. He is CEO and co-founder of a company called OpenCorporates, which describes itself as the largest open database of companies in the world. I checked his database just a few days ago, and the current count is 84.6 million companies. If you're not familiar with OpenCorporates, I think you should be. You can take a look around the site, and as far as data goes, feel free to look at as many records as you like. That's right, OpenCorporates is free to use, or should I say, open to use. The other reason I'm excited about having Chris here today is that he's one of the leading lights in the open data movement. And if you're not familiar with open data, you'll want to listen very closely. Open data is part philosophy and part business model, and it may have profound implications for those of us with proprietary data products, or should I say closed data. Chris is not just a fascinating and increasingly significant data publisher in his own right, he is at this forefront of this entirely new approach to the data business. You may not agree with everything Chris has to say, but I think you need to hear it because open data is here to stay. So without further ado, let me call up to this stage our special guest speaker today, Chris Taggart.
Thanks, Russell. Maybe I'll stand in this bit here, and then I'm not sort of hidden in the shadows up there. What is OpenCorporates? As Russell said, great intro, by the way. It's one of the best I've heard. A really good summing up of why this is important and what we're doing. Largest open database of companies in the world. But what does that mean? What we're intending to do here is, our goal is to have every single company in the world in OpenCorporates in an openly licensed database, free to use. We see this as being the critical underlying data set of all business, all business, the entire corporate world, all other company information. It's about who you're working for. It's about who you're doing business with. It's about who your competitors are. It's about who government is procuring with. And there is so much information that's out there, stuck in silos, particularly government silos, corporate registers, but other government data sources as well, particularly regulatory data, almost hardly ever connected to each other. And much of it is actually quite important, but obscure. Things like government gazettes, which are not that common in the US, but incredibly common in the rest of the world, where official notices have to be put in there. Information about whether a company's birth and life, about whether it's increasing its share capital, all this sort of stuff. But again, locked away, usually in PDFs. So what OpenCorporates does is quite different from many of the traditional ones. We've been going 3 years, 2.5 years now. We started with about 3 million companies in 3 different jurisdictions. One of the critical things is this idea that we focus on legal entities. Now, of course, when we're talking about business, my background's actually as a journalist, but then I ended up running magazine publishing companies, consumer magazine publishing companies in Europe, and bought and sold companies as well. But when you're talking about what do you need to know about companies, whether it's who works there, whether it's who owns it, who controls it, how they're connected, what activities they're doing, whether this is someone you want to be doing business with, there are lots of different angles that you will want to go from, lots of different dimensions. What about this division? What about this person? Where did they come from before? All sorts of different reasons. But one of the critical ones that's been really neglected is this idea of the legal entity. So a company at its heart is an artificial entity, an artificial creation of the law. It doesn't exist. You can't touch it. You can't put it in handcuffs. You can't walk. You can't bump into it in a bar. it is an artificial thing, but nevertheless it is treated by the law as having as if it were a person. And specifically, it means it has the power to enter into contract. And the reason that's really important is because actually everything that we do in the business world is about entering into contracts of some form or other, whether it's an employment contract, or whether it's a contract for supply or a service. We enter into contracts, and the question is who are you doing business with? If you don't know, if all you know about a company is its DUNS number, and you don't know whether that company is incorporated here and where the parent is incorporated and so on, do you really know whether you're doing business with it? So we think that this is essentially the ground truth. This information is in corporate registers around the world. We have a rule: we don't ever we don't buy data, but we also don't manually import it. We only ever write code to pull in data from disparate sources, particularly company registers. Actually, we've just hit 100 jurisdictions yesterday. And we should be hitting 102 tomorrow, I think. The two that we're adding next will be Minnesota and Myanmar, which used to be called Burma. The two that we added to take us to 100 yesterday were Tajikistan and New Brunswick in Canada. So what we do is we go out and get our hands dirty with what's there, take the data, normalize the key fields, whatever they call different types of company types, whatever to call those fields for company type, or whatever they call whether it's an incorporation date or a setup date or registration date, all those sorts of different things, normalizing dates, things like that. But then we also transform those dates as well, make the entire thing searchable across all those jurisdictions. It allows us to do things such as matching foreign companies to foreign branches to the home companies. Now, this is an example of a sort of a previously neglected data set, which is particularly interesting. A branch in a legal sense often it's usually called a foreign corporation in the US, is not actually a separate legal entity. It is the presence of an out of jurisdiction legal entity in that jurisdiction. So, for example, if a Delaware company does business in New York and has a place of business there, then it needs to register as a foreign corporation with New York State. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because if you're looking just at New York State or looking at the data that's connected with that, and that company that it's saying that is still in good standing or active, but actually the Delaware company is dissolved, then you've potentially got a problem. But even more than that, it's useful because, do you know what? Getting Delaware information, particularly getting Delaware directors, is hard. But if you connect the New York State branch to the Delaware one, then you get the CEO. And if you connect the Mississippi one to the Delaware branch, you get other offices as well. And you can start to combine information to that. And that's true. That's why we have directors of some Cayman Islands companies, even though it's really hard to get directors of Cayman Islands companies because they have, for example, registered in the UK and they have to declare that in that. So those sorts of things which happens in the background makes it enormously useful. And we're open too. And this is for a number of reasons. We think that open is fundamentally a good thing. A good thing for society. We're a for-profit enterprise, but we are, I guess, what you'd call a social enterprise. Would probably be a benefit corp if we were incorporated in the US. So we have a public benefit as part of our core mission, but we are also a for-profit as well. But we think that open is important for society, for good business, actually. Otherwise you get these choke points with, let's take the DUNS number, for example, a classic choke point. It makes it very difficult, it makes the data bad, and it makes it very difficult for other people to play in that area. From an economist's point of view, you'd call that a rent-seeking business model rather than one adding value. So we think it's really good because it lowers those barriers for innovation. And that's one of in the US has particularly with federal data, has always been about making this information without those IP restrictions, and now other countries are doing that too. I think it's better for competition, not just by lowering barriers to innovation, but you can see who you're competing with. It means that the setup costs aren't as great. It's much better for sharing. It's you're allowed, if you can have different data sets that are open, and you've got open identifiers, for example, or it's clear about what you mean, then you can actually combine that data much better. We think one of the fundamental things is about companies is that who are you doing business with? Every company should be able to answer that question with their clients, with their suppliers, with their competitors. Who are you doing business with? Who are you working for? Who are you lending to? And it comes back down to the fundamentals of good business, of actually creating a market. Having this access to this information is a requirement for that. This has been endorsed by the biggest countries in the world as well. They signed an open data charter about a year ago, talking about open data by default for their government data, and actually compared with the US. So the US federal data has been open for quite a long time, depending on your definition of open. But that wasn't true of UK data. So UK data, until fairly recently, was and still is under Crown copyright, and that meant you can't do anything without permission of the Crown. Similarly, French, German, Japanese data, typically lots of IP and practical restrictions on it as well. But they all basically got together and agreed to this. Quality, quantity, user bar all. It's not just about governance, it's also about innovation. So I could talk about open till the cows come home, but the truth is that most people don't give a damn about open. I'm sure many of you really don't care about open, and that's not because you're not smart people, you're not good people. It's just that you've got your lives to live, you've got a business to make work, you've got other things to do with. But we think that it's absolutely a fundamental requirement. Why is federal data open? Because constitutionally it's almost required to be so. And similarly, there are lots of things that people don't care about that are really critical to the way the world works. They don't care about the underlying protocols that work the internet. They don't care about security. The security protocols and algorithms. But we do think it's, as well as it being better innovation and competition, there is also a secret weapon which open has. We think that open is fundamentally about quality when it comes down to it. These are typical proprietary data quality issues, which I'm sure you all encounter every single day. There's accuracy problems, and that's because where it comes from. It's because the data is rekeyed. It's accuracy because actually you've got a bit of siloed data over there, someone else has got a siloed data over there. They don't know necessarily it's talking about the same data, they can't combine it. They end up, you have small audiences looking at that data, essentially. When you have things that's been contributed by people, and particularly if it's things where there's an incentive to lie, then often they do lie. And there's little downside if that is not going to be in the public realm. Lots of gaps in the data. I mean, in a sense, this sort of event is about filling in some of those gaps. But those gaps are there partly exist for structural reasons because of the cost of putting that data together, and and also the uses are limited to specific small audiences, which again has implications to data accuracy and also to combining the data and doing something genuinely useful. Many of the systems in place today are real legacy systems. I mean, the DUNS number I think was 65. Now, I'm not going to knock. I'm not trying to knock Dun and Bradstreet here, although I do think that Dun. I think that because apart from anything else, they're clients of ours. But but they've got, but the DUNS number was created in 65 before that, and many of their systems have been working extremely well for many of those customers, and those were systems that were engineered, the data models were done 20, 30 years ago. We've got legacy data models. Anyone that's been around for more than 2 or 3 years has got legacy data models. But the problem is that once they become, embedded in a system, proprietary, they are particularly long-standing ones like DUNS numbers. They become really hard to re-engineer. They're really because actually not enough people have got visibility of what's going on. And one of the things that's meant is that these legacy data models, as well as there being, the model sometimes being wrong, there's a real lack of granularity, because these were the data models that were created in the days where memory was expensive, in the days where storage space was expensive, and you couldn't afford to do that sort of stuff. The errors go uncorrected because of the lack of feedback mechanisms. This is a critical one, and one that we're finding that really resonates with people. They're black box data. Now, what we think of as black box data is something where you just say, take this on trust. This company is the parent of that. We guarantee it by 60%, but this is the parent of it. Well, is that one of the times where this is, 2 weeks, this comes from an official source 2 weeks ago, or is this one of the times where it comes from 3 years ago from some place that we're not quite sure where it is? Actually, as a journalist, I can cope with data that's 30% accurate if it's a question of, because it's going to give me leads, it's going to give me a potential story route. Maybe if you're doing sales or marketing, you can cope with that sort of percent accurate. But you want to be able to know what it is. You want to know what this particular data point, where that came from, where that was retrieved. Because only then have you got confidence. I'm not going to go to print. I wouldn't go to print with something that had 40% chance of being wrong. I'd want to know exactly what it was. That's really important as well with things like KYC, but it's also important with credit risk as well. You need to know those sorts of different things and be able to do it. But it's incredibly important for combining with different data sets, whether this came from an official source, an unofficial source, whether it was a year ago, 2 years ago, a week ago. Those sorts of things allow you to combine with it. And finally, proprietary identifiers. What is a proprietary identifier? Fundamentally, it's an internal identifier. A DUNS number does nothing more than identifies an entry in a Dun & Bradstreet database. And one of the problems with that is you can't, they're really difficult to reuse and make good combining data. What's the, make it to be data be combined in a good way, in an accurate way, combining things like DUNS numbers and tickers, for example, or DUNS numbers and LEIs, really problematic, partly because of the nature of those identifiers. Okay, so quickly, what our target is every single piece of public data in the world, match the relevant company. We only take public data. We don't take any proprietary data. We don't buy any data. We just basically about going out and taking this data and cleaning it up. The data we've got it from, as well as the company data, we also have things like WIPO trademarks. We're going to be doing a lot more on trademarks in the next 6 months. Government spending data, corporate structures, which we parse from the SEC every night. This is Goldman Sachs network. This is partly from the Federal Reserve. This is the US, all the entities in the US, how they're connected to the UK, Ireland, Luxembourg. This is the Cayman Islands. This is Australia, and down here, there's a whole bunch of companies which aren't actually on the Federal Reserve data set. That's from New Zealand, where we have very good shareholding data. We currently have a focus of pulling in and writing code to pull in every single bank license in the world. We already have something like 350,000, possibly 400,000 US financial licenses. Business licenses is something we just started working on. Non-profit data and government gazettes. Essentially, the demand is what we do is either based on what the demand is from particular clients. It's still available for everyone else. It's just that they basically say we'd like you to go after that, and we know that we'll be a customer. or where there's structural benefits, for example, corporate relationship information. The business model is pretty innovative. So the website is free to use without any barriers, and that's part of the public good, but that's also part of improving the quality. We get emails every day, lots of them, from people saying the data is wrong, and in about 60% of the cases, it's wrong on the official record. So we go and tell them to change the official record, and then we'll update that. In about 35% of cases, it isn't actually wrong; they just don't want it to be on there. And in 5%, and things like I don't want people to know that my last business went bankrupt, essentially. And it's like, well, that's kind of why it's there, so that people know that was a track record. And about 5% of them, actually probably more like 2%, I would say, is things that we can internally improve. And so we get that feedback mechanism to doing that. But if you want the data, you can get it for free if you're doing an open data project. But otherwise, there's this cross-subsidy model where you pay for removal of the share-alike restriction. Share-alike is something that started in the open source world, which basically said if you take this, whatever the product of this thing is, that must also be open too. And if you're doing an open data project, there's no problem in that. If you're, however, importing that into a proprietary database, you probably don't want to make that proprietary database entirely free and public. We think this brings lots of public benefits. Quality. The efficiencies of scale are starting to really kick in now. We're still a fairly tiny team. There's 8 of us, recruiting for 2 people at the moment. And one of the things that you get that full provenance for every single bit of data, where it came from and when we got it. And these are some of the current clients. We've only really been in a sort of commercial mode for the last 6 months or so. Credit Safe was actually a client from last year and still are, and have been doing more with them. They're in the US now, but they're a credit reference agency. But the World Bank, who we partner with on a couple of projects, but also they take some of our data. OneSource, now Ventian, LinkedIn, Dun & Bradstreet, as I said. Funding Circle, peer-to-peer lending. Yeah, that's it.